Question 1. Comparative studies suggest that the selection of a risk assessment methodology for a contaminated site can significantly influence remediation decisions and outcomes. Considering a hypothetical brownfield redevelopment project with a history of mixed industrial use and potential for residential exposure, which of the following approaches best aligns with best practices for conducting a defensible environmental risk assessment under the U.S. regulatory framework? Option A. Adopting a risk assessment methodology primarily driven by the lowest cost remediation option, regardless of the thoroughness of the risk characterization. Option B. Utilizing a simplified, generic risk assessment model that applies default exposure parameters and toxicity values without detailed site-specific data collection, prioritizing rapid completion. Option C. Employing a tiered risk assessment approach that begins with screening-level evaluations and progresses to more detailed, site-specific analyses if initial screening indicates potential unacceptable risks, utilizing U.S. EPA guidance documents for each tier. Option D. Focusing exclusively on historical land use records to infer potential risks, without conducting current site investigations or considering contemporary exposure scenarios. The correct answer is C. Employing a tiered risk assessment approach that begins with screening-level evaluations and progresses to more detailed, site-specific analyses if initial screening indicates potential unacceptable risks, utilizing U.S. EPA guidance documents for each tier. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in environmental remediation, where multiple risk assessment methodologies can be applied, each with its own strengths and limitations. The professional challenge lies in selecting the most appropriate methodology that aligns with regulatory requirements, site-specific conditions, and the project's objectives, ensuring that the resulting risk characterization is scientifically sound, defensible, and protective of human health and the environment. The need for careful judgment is paramount, as an inappropriate methodology can lead to inaccurate risk estimation, inefficient remediation strategies, and potential regulatory noncompliance. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a comprehensive and defensible risk assessment that is tailored to the specific site and regulatory context. This involves a thorough understanding of the potential contaminants, exposure pathways, and receptor populations, and selecting a methodology that can adequately address these factors. Adherence to established guidance documents and regulatory frameworks ensures that the assessment meets legal and scientific standards. This approach fosters transparency and allows for clear communication of risks to stakeholders. An incorrect approach that relies solely on a generic, one-size-fits-all methodology fails to account for site-specific complexities. This can lead to either overestimation or underestimation of risks, resulting in unnecessary remediation costs or inadequate protection. Ethically, this is a failure to exercise due diligence and professional responsibility. Another incorrect approach that ignores potential exposure pathways or receptor populations is a direct violation of fundamental risk assessment principles and regulatory mandates. This represents a significant ethical lapse and a failure to meet professional obligations to protect public health and the environment. Third incorrect approach that prioritizes speed or cost over scientific rigor and regulatory compliance is also professionally unacceptable. This demonstrates a disregard for the integrity of the risk assessment process and can lead to flawed conclusions with serious consequences. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic evaluation of available risk assessment methodologies against the specific project requirements. This includes 1. Clearly defining the project objectives and regulatory drivers. 2. Thoroughly characterizing the site conditions, including contaminant types, concentrations, and distribution. 3. Identifying all potential human and ecological receptors and their potential exposure pathways. 4. Reviewing relevant regulatory guidance and best practices for risk assessment. 5. Critically evaluating the strengths and limitations of different methodologies in the context of the site-specific data. And 6. Selecting the methodology that provides the most robust, defensible, and protective risk characterization, ensuring clear documentation of the rationale for the chosen approach. Question 2. Compliance review shows that during a Phase I environmental site assessment, ESSA, for a commercial property transaction, a consultant identified a historical REC related to past underground storage tank usage. The client, who is the potential buyer, has requested that this REC be excluded from the final report, stating it is a historical issue unlikely to pose current risks and that its inclusion would jeopardize the deal. As a certified environmental remediation specialist, what is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Exclude the historical REC from the report as requested by the client to facilitate the transaction, assuming it is indeed a minor historical issue. Option B. Include a clear and detailed description of the historical REC in the report, along with an assessment of its potential implications, while also noting the client's concerns and the basis for its inclusion as per regulatory standards. Option C. Include the historical REC in a separate, informal addendum to the report, rather than in the main body, to satisfy the client's request for discretion. Option D. Report the historical REC only if the client explicitly asks for it after reviewing the initial draft of the report. The correct answer is B. Include a clear and detailed description of the historical REC in the report, along with an assessment of its potential implications, while also noting the client's concerns and the basis for its inclusion as per regulatory standards. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common ethical dilemma in environmental consulting, where a consultant faces pressure to downplay or omit findings that could negatively impact a client's transaction. The challenge lies in balancing the professional obligation to accurately report environmental conditions with the client's desire for a favorable outcome. The consultant must navigate potential conflicts of interest and maintain professional integrity while adhering to regulatory standards. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves clearly and accurately documenting all recognized environmental conditions, REC, in the Phase I ESA report, regardless of their potential impact on the client's transaction. This aligns with the ethical obligations of a certified environmental remediation specialist to provide objective and thorough assessments. Specifically, adhering to ASTM E1527-13, Standard Practice for Environmental Site Assessments, Phase I environmental site assessment process is paramount. This standard mandates the identification and reporting of RECs, historical RECs HREC, and controlled RECs CREC, based on the all-appropriate inquiries process. Failing to report a REC, even if it's a historical issue that may not require immediate remediation, is a failure to fulfill the core purpose of the Phase I ESA, which is to identify potential environmental liabilities. Professional practice dictates that the report should present findings factually, allowing the client and their legal counsel to make informed decisions based on the identified risks. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to omit the REC from the report because it is a historical issue and the client believes it will not affect the transaction. This is a direct violation of ASTM E1527-13, which requires the identification and reporting of all RECs, HREC, and CREC. Ethically, this constitutes misrepresentation and a failure to uphold professional standards. It deprives the client and potential future parties of crucial information regarding environmental conditions. Another incorrect approach is to downplay the significance of the REC in the report, suggesting it is minor without sufficient justification or evidence. While professional judgment is involved in assessing the potential impact of a REC, the report must still clearly identify the REC and provide sufficient detail for the client to understand its nature. Minimizing a REC without a sound basis is a form of bias and can lead to an incomplete understanding of the environmental risks, potentially resulting in future liabilities for the client. A third incorrect approach is to only report the REC after the client explicitly asks for it, or to only include it in a separate, less formal communication. The Phase I ESA report is the formal deliverable and the primary document for communicating findings. Omitting a REC from the main report and only disclosing it informally or upon prompting is a failure to conduct all appropriate inquiries, as required by ASTM E1527-13, and a breach of professional transparency. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such situations by prioritizing their ethical obligations and regulatory requirements over client pressure. The decision-making process should involve 1. Thoroughly reviewing the findings against the requirements of ASTM E1527-13 and any other applicable regulations. 2. clearly documenting all identified RECs, HREC, and CREC with supporting evidence. 3. Communicating these findings to the client in a clear, objective, and professional manner, explaining the implications of each finding. 4. If the client expresses concerns or requests clarification, reiterating the professional obligations and the importance of accurate reporting for informed decision-making. 5. If client pressure persists and compromises professional integrity, considering withdrawal from the engagement in accordance with ethical guidelines. Question 3. To address the challenge of conducting a comprehensive environmental compliance audit within a compressed timeframe, an environmental remediation specialist must decide on the most effective strategy. The specialist has access to historical audit reports, site operational plans, and relevant federal and state environmental regulations. What approach best ensures regulatory compliance and professional integrity? Option A. Solely rely on the most recent historical audit report to identify potential areas of concern, assuming current conditions mirror past findings. Option B. Expedite the audit by minimizing detailed record-keeping and focusing on a superficial review of readily available documents. Option C. Prioritize audit activities based on a risk assessment of potential environmental impacts and regulatory scrutiny, focusing on high-risk areas first while ensuring sufficient documentation of all findings. Option D. Focus exclusively on areas with historically low compliance issues to ensure a quick and positive audit outcome. The correct answer is C. Prioritize audit activities based on a risk assessment of potential environmental impacts and regulatory scrutiny, focusing on high-risk areas first while ensuring sufficient documentation of all findings. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because the environmental remediation specialist is tasked with conducting an audit under a tight deadline, which inherently creates pressure to cut corners or overlook critical details. The specialist must balance the need for thoroughness with the practical constraints of time and resources, ensuring that the audit remains effective and compliant with all applicable regulations. Careful judgment is required to prioritize audit activities and identify potential risks without compromising the integrity of the findings. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a systematic and risk-based methodology. By focusing on high-risk areas first, the specialist ensures that the most critical compliance issues are identified and addressed promptly. This aligns with the principles of environmental management systems and regulatory oversight, which emphasize proactive identification and mitigation of environmental risks. Adhering to established auditing standards and protocols, such as those outlined by the EPA for compliance audits, ensures that the audit is comprehensive, objective, and defensible. This approach also demonstrates professional due diligence and a commitment to upholding environmental protection standards. An incorrect approach that involves solely relying on historical audit data without verifying current site conditions would be a significant regulatory failure. Environmental conditions and operational practices can change rapidly, rendering outdated information irrelevant and potentially leading to the overlooking of new or ongoing noncompliance. This would violate the fundamental principle of an audit, which is to assess current compliance status. Another incorrect approach, focusing exclusively on low-risk areas to complete the audit quickly, would be an ethical and regulatory failure. This demonstrates a lack of professional responsibility and a disregard for the potential environmental impacts of noncompliance in high-risk areas. It fails to meet the objective of a compliance audit, which is to identify and rectify all significant deviations from regulatory requirements, regardless of perceived risk level. A third incorrect approach, skipping detailed documentation of findings to save time, would be a critical procedural and regulatory failure. Comprehensive documentation is essential for an audit to be credible, auditable, and to provide a clear basis for corrective actions. Without proper documentation, the audit findings cannot be substantiated, and the remediation specialist could face professional repercussions and regulatory penalties for an incomplete or unsubstantiated audit report. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Understanding the audit objectives and scope thoroughly. 2. Identifying and prioritizing potential risks based on site history, operational activities, and regulatory requirements. 3. Developing a detailed audit plan that allocates sufficient time for critical areas. 4. Employing a risk-based approach to audit activities, focusing on areas with the highest potential for noncompliance. 5. Maintaining meticulous documentation throughout the audit process. 6. Communicating any identified challenges or potential compromises to the client or relevant stakeholders promptly. Question 4. The performance metrics show a significant increase in groundwater contaminant levels at a CERCLA-designated site undergoing active remediation. The site's Remedial Action Plan, RAP, was developed under RCRA regulations for waste management. Which of the following actions best reflects the immediate professional and regulatory obligations? Option A. Delay reporting the observed increase to regulatory agencies until a complete root cause analysis is performed, to avoid premature conclusions and potential regulatory scrutiny. Option B. Continue the current remediation activities as outlined in the RAP, assuming the increase is within acceptable operational variability, and document the findings for the next scheduled progress report. Option C. Immediately notify the EPA and relevant state environmental agencies of the observed increase and initiate a focused investigation to determine the cause, while continuing the existing remediation activities as a precautionary measure. Option D. Immediately alter the remediation strategy to directly address the increased contaminant levels without prior consultation or approval from the EPA or state agencies. The correct answer is C. Immediately notify the EPA and relevant state environmental agencies of the observed increase and initiate a focused investigation to determine the cause, while continuing the existing remediation activities as a precautionary measure. Explanation. The performance metrics show a significant increase in groundwater contaminant levels at a site undergoing remediation under CERCLA. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires immediate and decisive action based on a complex interplay of federal environmental laws, specifically CERCLA and RCRA, to ensure public health and environmental protection while adhering to strict regulatory timelines and requirements. The remediation specialist must accurately interpret the data, understand the legal obligations, and select the most appropriate response strategy. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes immediate notification and a thorough investigation to determine the cause of the contaminant increase. This aligns with CERCLA mandate for identifying and addressing releases of hazardous substances and RCRA requirements for managing hazardous waste. Prompt reporting to the EPA and state agencies is crucial for transparency and regulatory compliance, allowing for collaborative decision-making and ensuring that any necessary modifications to the Remedial Action Plan (RAP) are made in accordance with federal regulations. This proactive stance minimizes further environmental damage and potential liability. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on continuing the existing remediation without investigating the cause fails to address the root of the problem. This could lead to ineffective remediation, continued environmental degradation, and potential violations of CERCLA requirement to implement a permanent solution and RCRA provisions for proper waste management. Another incorrect approach that involves altering the remediation strategy without proper notification and approval from regulatory agencies constitutes a significant violation of CERCLA administrative review and approval processes and RCRA permitting and operational requirements. This bypasses essential oversight, potentially leading to non-compliant and ineffective cleanup actions. A third incorrect approach that delays reporting the findings to regulatory bodies is a direct contravention of CERCLA reporting requirements for newly discovered information or significant changes in site conditions, and it undermines the collaborative nature of Superfund cleanups. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with data interpretation, followed by a comprehensive understanding of applicable federal laws, CERCLA, RCRA, etc. This involves assessing the implications of the data against regulatory obligations, consulting with legal counsel and regulatory agencies when necessary, and developing a phased response plan that includes investigation, reporting, and potential remediation adjustments, all documented meticulously. Question 5. Cost-benefit analysis shows that a less expensive remediation technology meets federal cleanup standards, but a more costly approach is required to satisfy specific state and local environmental regulations concerning groundwater protection and community impact. Which approach represents the most responsible and legally compliant path forward for a certified environmental remediation specialist? Option A. Seek a variance from the state and local regulations based on the federal compliance, assuming federal approval supersedes local concerns. Option B. Propose a hybrid approach that uses the less expensive technology but includes additional monitoring to mitigate potential state and local concerns. Option C. Implement the less expensive technology that meets federal standards, as this is the primary regulatory benchmark. Option D. Pursue the more costly approach that satisfies all applicable state and local regulations, even if it exceeds federal minimums. The correct answer is C. Implement the less expensive technology that meets federal standards, as this is the primary regulatory benchmark. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in environmental remediation, balancing the cost of a remediation strategy against its effectiveness and the specific requirements of state and local regulations. The remediation specialist must navigate potentially conflicting objectives, where a more expensive option might offer greater certainty or exceed minimum compliance, while a cheaper option might meet basic standards but carry higher long-term risks or face local opposition. The specialist's professional responsibility lies in selecting an approach that is technically sound, legally compliant, and ethically responsible, considering all stakeholders and potential impacts. The challenge is amplified by the fact that state and local regulations can be more stringent and nuanced than federal mandates, requiring a deep understanding of the specific legal landscape. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach prioritizes a thorough understanding and adherence to all applicable state and local environmental regulations, even if it leads to a higher initial cost. This represents best professional practice because environmental remediation is fundamentally about protecting public health and the environment. State and local laws often reflect specific community concerns and environmental sensitivities that may not be fully addressed by broader federal standards. Exceeding minimum compliance, particularly when driven by local regulatory requirements or best practices, demonstrates a commitment to due diligence and responsible environmental stewardship. Ethically, it aligns with the core principles of the Certified Environmental Remediation Specialist designation, which emphasizes competence, integrity, and a duty to protect the public and the environment. Regulatory compliance at the state and local level is not merely a legal obligation, but a critical component of effective and sustainable remediation. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to solely focus on the lowest cost option without adequately assessing its compliance with state and local regulations. This represents a significant regulatory failure because it risks non-compliance, leading to potential fines, legal action, remediation delays, and the need for more extensive and costly remediation later if the initial approach proves inadequate or violates specific local ordinances. Ethically, it prioritizes financial expediency over environmental protection and public safety, violating the specialist's duty of care. Another incorrect approach would be to implement a remediation strategy that meets federal standards but ignores potentially more stringent state or local requirements. This is a regulatory failure because federal regulations often set a floor, not a ceiling, for environmental protection. State and local governments have the authority to enact stricter rules to address unique local conditions or public health concerns. Failing to identify and comply with these specific mandates is a direct violation of the legal framework and demonstrates a lack of due diligence. Ethically, it shows a disregard for the specific concerns and legal authority of the governing bodies responsible for the local environment. A third incorrect approach would be to assume that a remediation strategy approved at the federal level automatically satisfies all state and local requirements. This is a critical oversight and a regulatory failure. Environmental laws are layered, and a permit or approval from one agency does not grant immunity from the requirements of another. State and local agencies often have their own permitting processes, review criteria, and enforcement mechanisms that must be independently satisfied. Ethically, this approach demonstrates a superficial understanding of the regulatory landscape and a failure to conduct the necessary research and due diligence required for responsible remediation. Professional reasoning. Professionals in environmental remediation must adopt a hierarchical approach to regulatory compliance, always starting with the most stringent applicable requirements. This involves 1. Identifying all potentially applicable federal, state, and local regulations. 2. Thoroughly reviewing the specific requirements of each identified regulation, paying close attention to any differences or additional mandates at the state and local levels. 3. Engaging with relevant regulatory agencies, federal, state, and local, early in the planning process to clarify requirements and ensure alignment. 4. Developing a remediation plan that demonstrably meets or exceeds all identified regulatory standards, considering cost-benefit not just in terms of initial expenditure, but also long-term effectiveness, compliance assurance, and risk reduction. 5. Documenting all regulatory research, communications, and decisions to demonstrate due diligence and compliance. Question 6. Strategic planning requires a thorough understanding of potential environmental liabilities associated with a commercial property acquisition. A client is considering purchasing a former industrial site with a long operational history. Which approach to environmental due diligence best aligns with regulatory requirements and professional best practices for identifying potential contamination and informing the client's decision-making? Option A. Conduct a visual inspection of the property and review readily available public records to identify obvious signs of contamination. Option B. Rely on the seller's existing environmental reports without independent verification, assuming they accurately reflect the property's condition. Option C. Focus solely on current site conditions and immediate environmental hazards, deferring any historical investigations to a later stage if contamination is suspected. Option D. Perform a comprehensive Phase I environmental site assessment (ESA) that includes historical research, site reconnaissance, interviews with current and past owners/operators, and review of government records, adhering to the all-appropriate inquiries I standards. The correct answer is A. Conduct a visual inspection of the property and review readily available public records to identify obvious signs of contamination. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because environmental due diligence, particularly during property transactions, involves navigating complex regulatory landscapes and potential liabilities. The core challenge lies in accurately assessing the environmental condition of a property to inform a client's decision-making, balancing the need for thoroughness with cost-effectiveness and time constraints. A key ethical consideration is the duty to provide objective and accurate information to the client, even if it reveals unfavorable conditions. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it aligns with the fundamental principles of environmental due diligence as mandated by regulatory frameworks such as the U.S. EPA's All Appropriate Inquiries Rule 40 CFR Part 312. This rule establishes the standards and practices for conducting all appropriate inquiries to qualify for landowner liability protections under CERCLA. A comprehensive Phase I environmental site assessment (ESA) systematically identifies potential or existing environmental contamination through historical research, site reconnaissance, interviews, and review of government records. This thoroughness ensures that all potential environmental concerns are identified, allowing the client to make informed decisions regarding acquisition, remediation, or risk management. It also fulfills the regulatory requirement for demonstrating all appropriate inquiries to potentially shield the client from future cleanup liabilities. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on readily visible issues fails to meet the all appropriate inquiries standard. This oversight can lead to significant regulatory and ethical failures. Ethically, it breaches the duty of care owed to the client by providing incomplete and potentially misleading information. From a regulatory standpoint, it jeopardizes the client's ability to claim landowner liability protection under CERCLA, exposing them to substantial financial risks for pre-existing contamination. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes speed and cost reduction over thoroughness by skipping critical historical research or site interviews is also professionally unacceptable. This approach ignores the foundational elements of environmental due diligence. Regulatory failure occurs because it bypasses essential investigative steps required by AAI. Ethically, it demonstrates a lack of diligence and a failure to act in the client's best interest, potentially leading to unforeseen environmental liabilities and remediation costs. A professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Clearly understanding the client's objectives and the scope of the transaction. 2. Identifying the applicable regulatory framework, e.g., under CERCLA in the U.S. 3. Developing a work plan that systematically addresses all required components of an environmental assessment, tailored to the property's history and potential risks. 4. Maintaining clear communication with the client throughout the process, explaining findings and their implications. 5. Documenting all activities and findings meticulously to support the conclusions and meet regulatory requirements. 6. Exercising professional judgment to interpret data and identify potential concerns, even if they are not immediately obvious. Question 7. Consider a scenario where a Phase I environmental site assessment has identified potential historical contamination at an industrial facility. Subsequent Phase II investigations have confirmed the presence of a dissolved phase contaminant plume in the shallow groundwater. A municipal drinking water supply well is located approximately 500 feet downgradient from the facility. To accurately assess the potential impact of this plume on the drinking water source, which of the following approaches to groundwater sampling and analysis is most appropriate for ensuring defensible data for impact assessment? Option A. Conduct surface water sampling in a nearby creek that is not hydraulically connected to the shallow groundwater plume and analyze for a broad range of volatile organic compounds. Option B. Implement a phased groundwater investigation program that includes the installation of new monitoring wells strategically placed to delineate the plume's horizontal and vertical extent, followed by low-flow sampling techniques to obtain representative samples for analysis of a comprehensive suite of contaminants identified in the site history and relevant regulatory lists. Option C. Collect grab samples from existing monitoring wells that were installed for a previous, unrelated investigation and analyze only for the primary contaminant of concern identified in the Phase I assessment. Option D. Rely on historical groundwater data from off-site properties that are known to have different geological formations and land use histories without conducting any new site-specific sampling. The correct answer is B. Implement a phased groundwater investigation program that includes the installation of new monitoring wells strategically placed to delineate the plume's horizontal and vertical extent, followed by low-flow sampling techniques to obtain representative samples for analysis of a comprehensive suite of contaminants identified in the site history and relevant regulatory lists. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging due to the inherent uncertainty in assessing the impact of historical contamination on groundwater resources. The presence of a known contaminant plume, coupled with a nearby drinking water source, elevates the risk and necessitates a rigorous, defensible approach to sampling and analysis. The challenge lies in accurately characterizing the plume's extent, migration pathways, and potential for future impact, all while adhering to strict regulatory requirements and ensuring the integrity of the data for decision-making. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a systematic, risk-based methodology aligned with established environmental regulations. This involves a phased investigation that begins with a thorough understanding of site hydrogeology and contaminant distribution. The selection of appropriate groundwater sampling techniques, such as low-flow sampling, is critical for obtaining representative samples that minimize disturbance and prevent cross-contamination, thereby ensuring the analytical results accurately reflect subsurface conditions. The subsequent analysis of these samples for a comprehensive suite of relevant contaminants, guided by regulatory standards and potential exposure pathways, provides the data necessary for accurate impact assessment and informed remediation decisions. This approach is ethically sound as it prioritizes public health and environmental protection by ensuring decisions are based on reliable scientific data. An incorrect approach that relies solely on grab samples from existing monitoring wells without considering hydrogeological flow paths would be professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a lack of understanding of groundwater dynamics, leading to potentially unrepresentative data. Such an approach could underestimate or overestimate contaminant concentrations, resulting in flawed impact assessments and inappropriate remediation strategies. Ethically, this represents a failure to exercise due diligence and a disregard for the scientific principles necessary for effective environmental management. Another incorrect approach that involves analyzing only a limited subset of potential contaminants without considering the historical site use and potential for a broader range of pollutants would also be professionally unacceptable. This oversight could lead to the identification of only a portion of the contamination, leaving significant risks unaddressed. This failure to conduct a thorough characterization violates the principle of comprehensive assessment and could result in long-term environmental and health consequences. A third incorrect approach that neglects to establish a robust quality assurance/quality control (QA/QC) program for sampling and analysis would be professionally unacceptable. Without proper QA/QC, the reliability and defensibility of the data are compromised. This could lead to erroneous conclusions about the extent and severity of contamination, potentially resulting in inadequate remediation or unnecessary expenditure. Ethically, this represents a failure to uphold scientific integrity and provide accurate information for regulatory compliance and public safety. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough review of historical site data and regulatory requirements. This is followed by the development of a detailed work plan that outlines the investigation objectives, sampling strategy, and analytical parameters. During fieldwork, strict adherence to established protocols for sampling, handling, and preservation of samples is paramount. A robust QA/QC program should be implemented throughout the process. Finally, the interpretation of analytical data should be conducted by qualified professionals, considering hydrogeological conditions, potential exposure pathways, and regulatory standards to provide a comprehensive and defensible impact assessment. Question 8. The investigation demonstrates that initial surface water sampling upstream of a known industrial site has detected trace levels of several organic compounds. Considering the proximity of a municipal drinking water intake located approximately 1 mile downstream, which of the following approaches best addresses the potential risk to public health and the environment? Option A. Conduct additional sampling at the original upstream locations and analyze for the same suite of organic compounds to confirm the initial findings. Option B. Implement a targeted sampling program at the municipal drinking water intake and analyze for a comprehensive suite of contaminants, including those initially detected and other potential pollutants indicated by the industrial site's historical operations. Option C. Rely on the initial upstream data and assume that the dilution and natural attenuation processes will sufficiently mitigate any potential risk to the downstream drinking water intake. Option D. Expand the sampling network to include multiple locations further upstream and analyze for a broader range of general water quality parameters to assess overall surface water health. The correct answer is A. Conduct additional sampling at the original upstream locations and analyze for the same suite of organic compounds to confirm the initial findings. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because the initial surface water sampling, while appearing routine, has yielded results that raise concerns about potential contamination impacting a downstream drinking water intake. The challenge lies in accurately assessing the risk to public health and the environment, which necessitates a robust and defensible sampling and analytical strategy. The chosen approach must not only identify the presence and extent of contaminants, but also provide data that can be used for effective risk characterization and regulatory compliance under the specified framework. The correct approach, focusing on a risk-based strategy that includes targeted sampling at the point of potential impact and analysis for a comprehensive suite of relevant contaminants, represents best professional practice. This aligns with the principles of environmental risk assessment, which prioritize protecting human health and ecological receptors. By sampling at the downstream intake and analyzing for a broad range of potential contaminants indicated by the site history, the approach ensures that the most critical exposure pathway is evaluated. This methodology is ethically sound as it prioritizes public safety and is regulatory compliant by ensuring that the investigation addresses potential risks in a thorough and systematic manner, providing data for informed decision-making. An incorrect approach that relies solely on historical sampling locations without considering the downstream intake as a critical receptor fails to adequately assess the risk to public health. This is a regulatory failure because it may not meet the requirements for a comprehensive site investigation that considers all potential exposure pathways. Ethically, it is deficient as it prioritizes convenience over the protection of a vulnerable receptor. Another incorrect approach that involves analyzing only for a limited, predefined list of contaminants, without considering the site's history or potential for a broader range of pollutants, is also professionally unacceptable. This represents a regulatory failure by potentially overlooking significant contaminants of concern, leading to an incomplete risk assessment. Ethically, it falls short by not exercising due diligence in protecting public health and the environment from all reasonably foreseeable risks. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough review of the site history, potential contaminant sources, and the identification of all potential environmental receptors, including human populations. A risk-based approach should then guide the sampling strategy, prioritizing sampling locations that represent the most significant exposure pathways. The analytical plan should be comprehensive enough to detect all relevant contaminants of concern, informed by the site history and regulatory requirements. This systematic process ensures that the investigation is scientifically sound, ethically responsible, and regulatory compliant, leading to effective risk management and remediation decisions. Question 9. Upon reviewing the Phase Roman II Environmental Site Assessment (ESSA) report for a commercial property, it was noted that several soil samples contained lead and arsenic at concentrations exceeding preliminary screening levels. However, the report also indicated that the site is currently undeveloped with no immediate plans for residential or sensitive land use. Considering the potential for future development and the need for a defensible risk assessment, which of the following approaches best aligns with regulatory expectations for determining the need for further action? Option A. Initiate a detailed human health risk assessment, HHRA, and if applicable, an ecological risk assessment, ERA, to evaluate the actual risks posed by the detected concentrations under current and potential future land use scenarios. Option B. Immediately proceed with soil excavation and off-site disposal of the contaminated soil to eliminate any potential future liability, regardless of the actual risk posed. Option C. Conduct a limited sampling program focused solely on the areas with exceedances to confirm the extent of contamination without further risk evaluation. Option D. Conclude that no further action is required as the site is currently undeveloped and the exceedances are only at preliminary screening levels, assuming no immediate exposure. The correct answer is A. Initiate a detailed human health risk assessment, HHRA, and if applicable, an ecological risk assessment, ERA, to evaluate the actual risks posed by the detected concentrations under current and potential future land use scenarios. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because the Phase Roman II Environmental Site Assessment (ESSA) has identified potential contaminants of concern at levels that exceed preliminary screening criteria. The challenge lies in determining the appropriate next steps for risk assessment and potential remediation without overcommitting resources or underestimating potential environmental and human health risks. Careful judgment is required to balance regulatory compliance, cost-effectiveness, and the protection of human health and the environment. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it aligns with the iterative nature of environmental risk assessment as outlined in relevant U.S. EPA guidance and state-specific regulations. By proceeding with a detailed human health risk assessment, HHRA, and potentially an ecological risk assessment, ERA, the environmental professional is systematically evaluating the actual risks posed by the identified contaminants. This involves considering exposure pathways, receptor populations, and toxicity data to determine if the exceedances pose a significant threat. This methodical approach ensures that remediation efforts, if necessary, are targeted and proportionate to the identified risks, thereby fulfilling the ethical and regulatory obligation to protect public health and the environment. An incorrect approach would be to immediately initiate extensive and costly remediation based solely on the initial screening exceedances. This fails to acknowledge that screening criteria are often conservative and do not account for site-specific conditions or actual exposure scenarios. Such an approach could lead to unnecessary expenditure of resources and potentially over-remediation, which is not only economically inefficient, but also ethically questionable if the actual risk is negligible. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the exceedances and proceed with site closure without further investigation. This represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure, as it disregards potential risks to human health and the environment, violating the core principles of environmental stewardship and potentially exposing the client and others to future liability and harm. It also fails to comply with the spirit and letter of regulations, requiring thorough site characterization and risk evaluation. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the regulatory requirements for Phase Roman II ESAs and risk assessment in the relevant jurisdiction. This involves reviewing the data generated, comparing it against applicable screening levels and regulatory standards, and then systematically evaluating the need for further investigation. The framework should prioritize a tiered approach to risk assessment, starting with screening and progressing to more detailed assessments only when warranted by the initial findings. This ensures that actions are data-driven, scientifically sound, and compliant with all applicable laws and guidelines, promoting responsible environmental management. Question 10. The risk matrix shows that the primary focus of the current remediation plan for petroleum hydrocarbons is on shallow soil contamination. However, during intrusive sampling for the planned excavation, a previously undetected plume of chlorinated solvents is identified at a depth significantly below the original scope, posing a potential threat to groundwater. As the certified environmental remediation specialist, what is the most appropriate immediate course of action? Option A. Begin excavating the chlorinated solvent plume immediately, as it represents a more immediate threat, and inform the regulatory agency and client afterward. Option B. Immediately notify the regulatory agency and the client of the new findings and recommend a modification to the remediation plan to address the chlorinated solvent plume. Option C. Continue with the approved remediation plan for petroleum hydrocarbons as scheduled, and address the chlorinated solvent plume in a future, separate phase of work. Option D. Document the chlorinated solvent plume, but delay notification to the regulatory agency and client until the current phase of petroleum hydrocarbon remediation is fully completed. The correct answer is B. Immediately notify the regulatory agency and the client of the new findings and recommend a modification to the remediation plan to address the chlorinated solvent plume. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because the remediation specialist is faced with conflicting priorities, adhering strictly to the approved remediation plan versus addressing a newly identified, potentially more significant risk that was not part of the original scope. The ethical dilemma lies in deciding whether to deviate from the approved plan, which could lead to regulatory scrutiny and potential delays, or to proceed with the original plan, potentially leaving a more immediate environmental threat unaddressed. The specialist must balance regulatory compliance, client interests, and their professional responsibility to protect human health and the environment. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves immediately notifying the regulatory agency and the client about the new findings and recommending a modification to the remediation plan. This represents best professional practice because it upholds transparency and accountability. By proactively informing the relevant parties, the specialist ensures that decisions are made collaboratively and with full knowledge of the situation. This aligns with regulatory requirements for reporting new information and potential changes to approved plans, and it demonstrates ethical conduct by prioritizing the most effective environmental protection. The specialist is acting as a responsible steward of the environment and a trusted advisor to the client. Incorrect approaches analysis. Proceeding with the original remediation plan without informing the agency or client about the new findings is a regulatory and ethical failure. It violates the principle of transparency and could lead to the approved plan being inadequate for the actual site conditions, potentially resulting in continued environmental degradation or exposure. This approach prioritizes expediency or avoiding potential complications over accurate risk assessment and management. Attempting to address the new contaminant without formal approval, even if it seems more efficient, is also a regulatory failure. Deviating from an approved work plan without proper authorization can lead to non-compliance, project delays, and potential penalties. It bypasses the established oversight mechanisms designed to ensure that remediation activities are technically sound and environmentally protective. Delaying notification to the client and agency until the original plan is complete is a significant ethical and regulatory failure. This approach conceals critical information that could impact the overall remediation strategy and potentially prolong environmental risk. It undermines the collaborative nature of remediation projects and demonstrates a lack of professional integrity. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes open communication, regulatory compliance, and sound scientific judgment. When new information arises that significantly alters the understanding of site conditions or risks, the immediate steps should be to 1. Document the new findings thoroughly. 2. Assess the potential impact of these findings on the current remediation plan. 3. Consult with relevant stakeholders, e.g., project manager, technical experts. 4. Prepare a clear and concise notification to the regulatory agency and client, outlining the findings, proposed actions, and any necessary plan modifications. 5. Await formal approval before implementing significant changes to the approved work plan. This systematic approach ensures that all parties are informed, decisions are based on current data, and regulatory requirements are met. Question 11. Examination of the data shows a statistically significant deviation from the expected remediation endpoint at one monitoring point, suggesting incomplete contaminant reduction, despite overall project trends indicating success. The client is eager for project closure and has expressed concern about the cost and time associated with further investigation or remediation at this specific point. Option A. Document the anomalous data, investigate its potential cause, and report the findings and any necessary further actions to the client and relevant regulatory agencies as per established protocols. Option B. Immediately conclude the remediation is complete based on the majority of data points meeting criteria, and advise the client that the single anomalous point is outside the scope of the current remediation phase. Option C. Exclude the anomalous data point from the final report, citing potential equipment malfunction or a localized, insignificant anomaly, and proceed with project closure based on the overall positive trends. Option D. Inform the client that the anomaly is likely a minor issue that will resolve itself over time and recommend delaying further action until a future, less costly, site-wide review. The correct answer is A. Document the anomalous data, investigate its potential cause, and report the findings and any necessary further actions to the client and relevant regulatory agencies as per established protocols. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the conflict between the immediate desire to present a favorable outcome and the ethical and regulatory obligation to accurately report all findings, even those that might be perceived negatively. The Certified Environmental Remediation Specialist, CERS, is entrusted with the integrity of environmental data and its subsequent reporting. The core of the challenge lies in balancing the client's potential expectations with the stringent requirements of reporting and record-keeping mandated by environmental regulations. The correct approach, which involves transparently documenting and reporting the anomalous data, represents best professional practice because it upholds the fundamental principles of environmental stewardship and regulatory compliance. Specifically, under typical U.S. environmental regulatory frameworks, e.g., CERCLA, RCRA state-level equivalents, accurate and complete reporting is paramount. Failure to report all relevant data, including deviations or anomalies, can lead to mischaracterization of site conditions, inadequate remediation strategies, and potential long-term environmental and human health risks. Ethical codes for environmental professionals also emphasize honesty, integrity, and the duty to protect public welfare. Documenting the anomaly, investigating its cause, and reporting it, even if it suggests a less successful outcome than initially hoped, ensures that all stakeholders have a complete and accurate understanding of the site's status. This allows for informed decision-making regarding further actions, risk assessment, and regulatory oversight. An incorrect approach that involves omitting or downplaying the anomalous data constitutes a significant regulatory and ethical failure. From a regulatory standpoint, this is a form of misrepresentation and can be considered a violation of reporting requirements under various environmental statutes. Such omissions can lead to penalties, fines, and revocation of professional licenses. Ethically, it breaches the duty of honesty and integrity, potentially exposing the public and the environment to harm. It also undermines the credibility of the professional and the remediation process. Another incorrect approach, such as immediately concluding the remediation is complete without addressing the anomaly, also fails to meet regulatory and ethical standards. Environmental remediation is a process that requires confirmation of cleanup goals. Ignoring data that suggests otherwise is a direct contravention of this principle. It prioritizes a premature closure over scientific accuracy and public safety. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic approach. 1. Identify and thoroughly document all data, including any anomalies or deviations from expected results. 2. Investigate the cause of the anomaly, This may involve resampling, laboratory quality control checks, or reevaluation of site conditions. 3. Consult relevant regulatory guidance and project-specific work plans regarding reporting of unexpected findings. 4. Communicate findings transparently and promptly to all relevant parties, including the client and regulatory agencies, as required. 5. Propose appropriate corrective actions or further investigations based on the confirmed findings. 6. Maintain comprehensive and accurate records of all activities, data, communications, and decisions. Question 12. The control framework reveals a contaminated industrial site with historical records indicating the potential presence of volatile organic compounds, VOC, and heavy metals in the soil. A certified environmental remediation specialist is tasked with developing a soil sampling and analysis plan to delineate the extent of contamination. Which of the following approaches best aligns with regulatory requirements and professional best practices for this scenario? Option A. Rely solely on historical data without conducting new sampling, assuming the existing information is sufficient for remediation planning. Option B. Prioritize cost-effectiveness by selecting a limited number of analytical tests for the most commonly suspected contaminants, and collect samples using the quickest available field methods. Option C. Conduct a uniform grid-based sampling pattern across the entire site at a fixed depth, analyzing for a broad range of common environmental contaminants to ensure all possibilities are covered. Option D. Implement a targeted sampling strategy based on the site's conceptual model, focusing on areas of historical spills and known subsurface features, and analyze samples for a comprehensive suite of VOCs and heavy metals using methods with regulatory-defined detection limits. The correct answer is D. Implement a targeted sampling strategy based on the site's conceptual model, focusing on areas of historical spills and known subsurface features, and analyze samples for a comprehensive suite of VOCs and heavy metals using methods with regulatory-defined detection limits. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in environmental remediation, ensuring that soil sampling accurately reflects the extent and nature of contamination to inform effective remediation strategies. The professional challenge lies in selecting sampling techniques and analytical methods that are both scientifically sound and compliant with the regulatory framework governing the site. Failure to do so can lead to inadequate remediation, increased costs, and potential long-term environmental liability. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a systematic, risk-based sampling strategy aligned with the site's conceptual model and regulatory requirements. This involves understanding the potential contaminant sources, pathways, and receptors to design a sampling plan that targets areas of highest concern. The chosen analytical methods must be appropriate for the suspected contaminants and meet the detection limits required by regulatory standards. This ensures that the data generated is legally defensible and sufficient for making informed decisions about remediation. An incorrect approach that relies solely on a grid-based sampling pattern without considering site-specific hydrogeology or historical data is professionally unacceptable. This can lead to missing localized, hot spots of contamination, resulting in an incomplete understanding of the problem and potentially ineffective remediation. Ethically, it fails to adequately protect human health and the environment by not thoroughly characterizing the contamination. Another incorrect approach, using a limited suite of analytical tests based on cost alone, is also professionally flawed. While cost is a consideration, it must not compromise the ability to identify all relevant contaminants of concern as defined by regulatory guidelines or the site's conceptual model. This can lead to a remediation plan that does not address the full scope of the contamination, creating future problems and potential legal repercussions. A third incorrect approach, neglecting to document the sampling methodology and chain of custody rigorously, undermines the integrity and defensibility of the data. Regulatory agencies require meticulous record-keeping to ensure the reliability of environmental data. Failure to maintain proper documentation can render the sampling results inadmissible in legal or regulatory proceedings, jeopardizing the entire remediation project. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that begins with a thorough review of the site's history, known or suspected contaminants, and relevant regulatory requirements. This informs the development of a site-specific sampling and analysis plan that balances scientific rigor with practical considerations. The plan should detail the sampling locations, depths, techniques, and analytical parameters, along with quality assurance/quality control, cost/QC measures. Throughout the process, clear communication with regulatory bodies and adherence to established protocols are paramount. Question 13. The assessment process reveals that real-time air quality monitoring data during an active soil vapor extraction remediation project is consistently showing elevated concentrations of target contaminants, exceeding the initial site assessment predictions and the established remediation goals for the current phase. Project team has been operating under the assumption that the remediation is progressing as expected based on historical data and the original conceptual site model. What is the most appropriate immediate course of action for the certified environmental remediation specialist? Option A. Immediately escalate to a more aggressive and costly remediation technology without further investigation to ensure compliance and address the unexpected contaminant levels. Option B. Disregard the elevated readings as anomalous data points, attributing them to potential interference from unrelated site activities, and proceed with the existing monitoring schedule. Option C. Continue with the current remediation operations as planned, assuming the elevated readings are temporary fluctuations or a result of equipment calibration drift, and reevaluate the situation at the next scheduled reporting interval. Option D. Immediately cease operations, notify the regulatory agency of the exceedances, and initiate a comprehensive investigation into the cause of the elevated readings, including a review of the monitoring equipment, sampling protocols, and the conceptual site model. The correct answer is D. Immediately cease operations, notify the regulatory agency of the exceedances, and initiate a comprehensive investigation into the cause of the elevated readings, including a review of the monitoring equipment, sampling protocols, and the conceptual site model. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common implementation challenge in environmental remediation. The discrepancy between initial site assessment data and real-time monitoring results during active remediation. The challenge lies in interpreting conflicting data, ensuring compliance with evolving regulatory standards, and making timely, defensible decisions that protect human health and the environment without unnecessarily delaying or escalating remediation costs. Professionals must balance the need for accurate data with the practicalities of field operations and the dynamic nature of contaminant behavior. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic, data-driven response that prioritizes regulatory compliance and site-specific conditions. This entails immediate notification of the regulatory agency, a thorough investigation into the cause of the elevated readings, e.g., equipment malfunction, changes in site conditions, or unexpected contaminant migration, and the implementation of a revised monitoring plan based on the NUD. This approach aligns with the principles of adaptive management, which is often implicitly or explicitly required by environmental regulations. It demonstrates due diligence, transparency with regulatory bodies, and a commitment to achieving remediation goals effectively and safely. The focus on understanding the root cause before making drastic changes is crucial for avoiding misallocation of resources and ensuring the long-term success of the remediation effort. Incorrect approach is analysis. Ignoring the elevated readings and continuing with the original monitoring schedule represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. It directly violates the principle of accurate reporting and the obligation to respond to conditions that may pose a risk. This approach could lead to continued exposure, non-compliance with permit conditions, and potential penalties. Assuming the elevated readings are due to equipment malfunction without proper investigation and verification is also a failure. While equipment issues are possible, a professional must conduct a systematic diagnostic process, including calibration checks, duplicate sampling, or using a secondary instrument before dismissing the data. This assumption bypasses the critical step of validating data integrity and could mask a genuine environmental issue. Immediately escalating to the most aggressive and costly remediation strategy without a thorough investigation into the cause of the elevated readings is an inefficient and potentially unnecessary approach. While it might seem like a precautionary measure, it fails to demonstrate sound professional judgment and could lead to significant cost overruns without a clear understanding of the problem. This approach neglects the principle of cost-effectiveness and proportionality in remediation, which is often a consideration in regulatory oversight. Professional reasoning. Professionals faced with such discrepancies should follow a structured decision-making process. 1. Data validation. Immediately assess the validity of the new data. This includes checking instrument calibration, reviewing sampling procedures, and considering potential interferences. 2. Root cause analysis. If the data appears valid, investigate the potential reasons for the elevated readings. This might involve reviewing recent site activities, weather patterns, or changes in operational parameters. 3. Regulatory communication. Proactively inform the relevant regulatory agency about the findings and the planned investigative steps. Transparency is key. 4. Adaptive management. Based on the investigation, develop and implement a revised monitoring or remediation plan. This plan should be scientifically sound, cost-effective, and compliant with all applicable regulations. 5. Documentation. Maintain meticulous records of all data, investigations, communications, and decisions made. Question 14. Analysis of a contaminated industrial site reveals potential subsurface plumes of chlorinated solvents. The certified environmental remediation specialist is tasked with selecting an initial geophysical survey method to delineate the extent of subsurface anomalies indicative of buried drums and potential solvent migration pathways. Several methods are technically feasible, but each has different cost implications and data resolution capabilities. The specialist must recommend a method that is both effective for the suspected contaminants and acceptable to the regulatory agency overseeing the site. Which of the following approaches best reflects professional best practice in selecting the geophysical survey method? Option A. Propose a geophysical method that has been successfully used on similar sites, without a detailed assessment of its specific applicability to the current site's unique geological and hydrogeological conditions. Option B. Conduct a thorough site-specific evaluation of potential geophysical methods, considering their ability to detect buried metallic objects and delineate subsurface anomalies related to solvent migration, in conjunction with regulatory guidance and stakeholder objectives, before making a recommendation. Option C. Recommend the most advanced and highest resolution geophysical method available, regardless of cost or the specific data requirements for initial plume delineation, to ensure no data is missed. Option D. Select the geophysical method with the lowest per acre cost, assuming all technically feasible methods will provide sufficient data for initial delineation. Correct answer is D. Select the geophysical method with the lowest per acre cost, assuming all technically feasible methods will provide sufficient data for initial delineation. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in environmental remediation, balancing the need for accurate site characterization with stakeholder concerns and regulatory compliance. The challenge lies in selecting the most appropriate geophysical survey method when multiple options exist, each with its own strengths, weaknesses, and cost implications. Stakeholders, including regulatory agencies, property owners, and potentially the public, have varying priorities, from ensuring thoroughness and data defensibility to managing project budgets and minimizing disruption. Careful judgment is required to select a method that is technically sound, cost-effective, and meets all regulatory requirements while addressing stakeholder expectations. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a systematic, data-driven selection process aligned with regulatory objectives. This involves understanding the site's geological and hydrogeological conditions, the suspected contaminants of concern, and the specific remediation goals. By consulting relevant guidance documents, such as those from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, for the Certified Environmental Remediation Specialist exam jurisdiction, and considering the limitations and capabilities of each geophysical method, the specialist can make an informed decision. This ensures that the chosen method will provide the necessary data for effective site characterization and remediation design, thereby fulfilling regulatory obligations under frameworks like the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act, CERCLA, or Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, RCRA. As applicable, ethical practice dictates transparency and justification for the chosen method, ensuring all parties understand the rationale. An incorrect approach that relies solely on cost without adequate technical justification represents a regulatory and ethical failure. It risks inadequate site characterization, leading to incomplete remediation, potential future liabilities, and noncompliance with regulatory standards. Ethically, it prioritizes financial considerations over the protection of human health and the environment. Another incorrect approach that selects a method based on familiarity or ease of use, without considering its suitability for the specific site conditions and objectives, is also professionally unacceptable. This can lead to the collection of irrelevant or insufficient data, wasting resources, and delaying remediation. Such an approach fails to meet the professional standard of care and may violate regulatory requirements for data quality and defensibility. A third incorrect approach that ignores stakeholder input or concerns, even if technically sound, can lead to project delays, disputes, and a lack of buy-in, undermining the overall success of the remediation effort and potentially creating ethical issues related to communication and collaboration. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Define the remediation objectives and regulatory requirements. 2. Characterize the site conditions, geology, hydrogeology, known or suspected contaminants. 3. Identify potential geophysical survey methods suitable for the site and objectives. 4. Evaluate the strengths, limitations, and costs of each method in relation to the project goals. 5. Consult relevant regulatory guidance and best practices. 6. Engage with stakeholders to understand their concerns and expectations. 7. Select the most appropriate method based on a comprehensive assessment of technical feasibility, regulatory compliance, cost-effectiveness, and stakeholder considerations. 8. Document the decision-making process and the rationale for the chosen method. Question 15. The control framework reveals that when assessing the behavior of tetrachloroethylene, PCE, in a contaminated groundwater plume beneath an industrial facility, which of the following approaches best predicts its likely fate and transport for effective remediation strategy selection under U.S. EPA regulations? Option A. Evaluating PCE's solubility in water and its tendency to volatilize into the unsaturated zone, considering the site's hydrogeology and groundwater flow direction. Option B. Prioritizing remediation technologies known to be cost-effective for chlorinated solvents, regardless of specific site conditions. Option C. Relying on historical remediation data from other sites with similar soil types, without detailed site-specific chemical analysis of PCE's behavior. Option D. Focusing solely on the measured concentrations of PCE in the groundwater, assuming higher concentrations indicate greater mobility. The correct answer is A. Evaluating PCE's solubility in water and its tendency to volatilize into the unsaturated zone, considering the site's hydrogeology and groundwater flow direction. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a remediation specialist to interpret and apply complex contaminant chemistry principles to predict the behavior of a specific contaminant under varying environmental conditions. The challenge lies in moving beyond simple identification of a contaminant to understanding its fate and transport, which directly impacts the selection of appropriate and effective remediation strategies. Misinterpreting contaminant behavior can lead to ineffective remediation, increased costs, potential for secondary contamination, and failure to meet regulatory cleanup standards, all of which carry significant legal and ethical implications. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding of the contaminant's intrinsic properties, e.g., solubility, volatility, Ca, pKa, and how these properties interact with site-specific environmental factors, e.g., soil type, pH, redox potential, presence of co-contaminants, groundwater flow. This allows for accurate prediction of whether the contaminant is likely to remain sorbed to soil, volatilize into the air, dissolve in groundwater, or undergo degradation. This predictive capability is fundamental to selecting remediation technologies that target the contaminant's dominant behavior, ensuring compliance with the U.S. EPA's regulatory framework under CERCLA and RCRA, which mandates the selection of remedies that are protective of human health and the environment. For example, understanding that a highly volatile organic compound, VOC, will preferentially partition to the vapor phase informs the selection of soil vapor extraction, SV, as a primary remediation technology. Incorrect approaches analysis. An approach that focuses solely on the contaminant's concentration without considering its chemical properties and environmental interactions is professionally unacceptable. This fails to acknowledge that high concentrations of a contaminant do not inherently dictate its mobility or persistence. For instance, a highly insoluble contaminant might remain localized despite high concentrations, while a more mobile contaminant at lower concentrations could spread widely. This oversight violates the regulatory requirement to implement effective and protective remedies, as it can lead to the selection of inappropriate technologies. An approach that prioritizes remediation technologies based on their perceived cost-effectiveness without a scientific basis for their suitability to the specific contaminant's behavior is also professionally flawed. Cost is a factor in remedy selection, but it must be secondary to technical feasibility and effectiveness in achieving cleanup goals. Selecting a cheap but ineffective technology for a contaminant that is highly mobile and persistent would result in long-term liability and failure to meet regulatory standards, representing a significant ethical and regulatory failure. An approach that relies on anecdotal evidence or past experiences with similar contaminants without site-specific investigation is professionally risky and potentially non-compliant. While experience is valuable, contaminant behavior can be significantly influenced by unique site conditions. Ignoring these site-specific factors can lead to incorrect assumptions about contaminant fate and transport, resulting in the selection of an inappropriate remediation strategy and potential regulatory noncompliance. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic, science-based approach. This involves 1. Thorough site characterization to understand geological, hydrological, and chemical conditions. 2. Detailed contaminant identification and quantification. 3. Application of contaminant chemistry principles to predict fate and transport based on intrinsic properties and site conditions. 4. Evaluation of potential remediation technologies against the predicted contaminant behavior and site characteristics. 5. Consideration of regulatory requirements and cost-effectiveness within the framework of technical feasibility and protectiveness. This iterative process ensures that the chosen remediation strategy is scientifically sound, regulatory compliant, and ultimately effective in protecting human health and the environment. Question 16. Operational review demonstrates that recent analytical results from groundwater monitoring wells at a Superfund site indicate a significant downward migration of a previously contained contaminant plume, exceeding the initial assumptions of the conceptual site model, CSM. The existing remediation strategy was designed based on the original CSM. What is the most appropriate professional course of action? Option A. Continue with the current remediation strategy as it was approved based on the initial conceptual site model, as re-evaluating would incur additional costs and delays. Option B. Update the conceptual site model to incorporate the new analytical data and re-evaluate the existing remediation strategy for its continued effectiveness and regulatory compliance. Option C. Immediately halt all remediation activities until a completely new site investigation can be initiated to understand the extent of the new plume migration. Option D. Disregard the new analytical results as they are unexpected and may require a costly redesign of the remediation system and proceed with the original plan. The correct answer is B. Update the conceptual site model to incorporate the new analytical data and re-evaluate the existing remediation strategy for its continued effectiveness and regulatory compliance. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in environmental remediation, the evolution of a conceptual site model, CSM, as new data emerges. A professional challenge lies in balancing the need for timely decision-making with the imperative to incorporate all relevant, credible information into the CSM. Prematurely finalizing a CSM based on incomplete data can lead to inefficient or ineffective remediation strategies, increased costs, and potential regulatory noncompliance. Conversely, endlessly delaying decisions while awaiting further data can also be detrimental. The core of the challenge is to identify the point at which the CSM is sufficiently robust to support informed decision-making, while acknowledging its inherent uncertainties. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach, which involves updating the CSM to reflect the new analytical results and then re-evaluating the remediation strategy, represents best professional practice under U.S. EPA guidance for CSM development. This aligns with the iterative nature of the CSM process, which is designed to evolve as understanding of the site conditions deepens. Regulatory frameworks, such as those outlined in CERCLA and RCRA, emphasize the need for a thorough understanding of site contamination to develop appropriate remedial actions. Updating the CSM ensures that the remediation strategy remains technically sound, cost-effective, and protective of human health and the environment, thereby meeting regulatory objectives. This approach demonstrates due diligence and a commitment to scientifically defensible decision-making. Incorrect approach is analysis. Proceeding with the original remediation strategy without incorporating the new data fails to acknowledge the dynamic nature of site characterization and regulatory expectations. This approach risks implementing a strategy that is no longer appropriate for the actual site conditions, potentially leading to incomplete cleanup, long-term liability, and non-compliance with the remedial action objectives, RAO, established under CERCLA. Ethically, it represents a failure to act with reasonable care and diligence. Ignoring the new analytical results because they are unexpected or inconvenient is a direct contravention of professional responsibility and regulatory requirements. Environmental professionals have an ethical and legal obligation to consider all credible data. This approach could lead to significant environmental harm and legal repercussions, as it demonstrates a deliberate disregard for information that could impact site safety and cleanup effectiveness. It also undermines the integrity of the entire remediation process. Focusing solely on the cost implications of re-evaluating the remediation strategy without a thorough technical and regulatory assessment is a flawed decision-making process. While cost is a factor in remediation, it must be balanced against technical feasibility, effectiveness, and regulatory compliance. Prioritizing cost over accurate site understanding and appropriate remediation can lead to long-term, more expensive problems and potential environmental damage, violating the principle of protecting human health and the environment. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic, iterative approach to CSM development. When new, credible data emerges that could significantly alter the understanding of contaminant sources, pathways, or receptors, the CSM must be revisited. This involves 1. Evaluating the quality and relevance of the new data. 2. Assessing its potential impact on the existing CSM assumptions. 3. Updating the CSM to reflect the revised understanding. And 4. Re-evaluating the remediation strategy based on the updated CSM. This process ensures that decisions are informed by the best available science and comply with regulatory requirements, such as those found in the EPA's guidance documents on CSMs and Superfund remediation. Question 17. Research into the remediation of a former industrial site has yielded two distinct sets of soil analytical data. The first set was collected during the initial site investigation phase using a standard EPA-approved method for volatile organic compounds, VOC. The second set was collected during a post-remediation verification sampling event using a rapid field screening method for VOCs. Both data sets indicate the presence of VOCs above the initial screening levels. As a certified environmental remediation specialist operating under U.S. EPA regulations, which approach to evaluating and comparing these two data sets is most appropriate for determining if remediation goals have been met. Option A. Focus the comparison on the data points from the field screening that show the lowest VOC concentration, as these are most indicative of successful remediation, and disregard any data points that remain elevated. Option B. Exclude the field screening data entirely from the comparison, as it is not a laboratory-certified method, and rely solely on the initial laboratory data to assess remediation effectiveness. Option C. Directly compare the raw numerical concentrations of VOCs from both data sets, assuming the field screening method provides a sufficiently accurate representation of the site conditions for decision-making. Option D. Conduct a statistical comparison of the two data sets, accounting for the known limitations and potential variability of the field screening method relative to the laboratory analysis, and assess whether the post-remediation concentrations are statistically below the remediation goals. Correct answer is D. Conduct a statistical comparison of the two data sets, accounting for the known limitations and potential variability of the field screening method relative to the laboratory analysis, and assess whether the post-remediation concentrations are statistically below the remediation goals. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in environmental remediation: the need to interpret and compare data from different sources and methodologies to make informed decisions about site status and remedial actions. The professional challenge lies in ensuring that the comparison is scientifically sound, legally defensible, and ethically responsible, adhering strictly to the regulatory framework governing environmental remediation specialists. This requires a deep understanding of data quality, statistical validity, and the specific requirements of the applicable regulations. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a systematic and scientifically rigorous comparison of data. This involves evaluating the quality and comparability of data sets, considering potential biases introduced by different sampling or analytical methods, and applying appropriate statistical tools to determine if observed differences are statistically significant or attributable to random variation. This aligns with the fundamental principles of environmental science and the regulatory mandate to base remediation decisions on reliable and representative data. Ethical practice demands transparency and accuracy in data interpretation to protect public health and the environment. An incorrect approach that relies solely on comparing raw numerical values without considering data quality or statistical significance fails to meet regulatory requirements for defensible decision-making. This can lead to erroneous conclusions about the extent of contamination or the effectiveness of remediation, potentially resulting in inadequate cleanup or unnecessary expenditure. Ethically, this approach is flawed as it misrepresents the site conditions. Another incorrect approach that selectively highlights data points that support a desired outcome while ignoring contradictory evidence constitutes data manipulation and is a serious ethical and regulatory violation. This undermines the integrity of the remediation process and can lead to significant legal and financial repercussions. It violates the professional duty to provide objective and unbiased assessments. A further incorrect approach that dismisses data from a particular source without a scientifically valid reason, such as documented quality control failures, is also professionally unacceptable. This can lead to an incomplete or biased understanding of the site conditions, potentially overlooking critical contamination pathways or sources. Regulatory frameworks often require justification for excluding data. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a multi-step approach. 1. Clearly define the objective of the data evaluation. 2. Identify all relevant data sets and their sources. 3. Critically assess the quality and comparability of each data set, including sampling methodologies, analytical methods, and quality assurance/quality control (QA/QC) data. 4. Select appropriate statistical and/or qualitative methods for comparison, considering the nature of the contaminants and the regulatory objectives. 5. Interpret the results of the comparison in the context of the regulatory framework and site-specific conditions. 6. Document the entire process, including justifications for any data exclusions or assumptions made. Question 18. Stakeholder feedback indicates a desire for greater transparency and understanding of the methodologies used in environmental risk assessments for a proposed remediation project. Given this, which approach to risk assessment best balances scientific rigor with stakeholder engagement and comprehension, while adhering to U.S. environmental regulatory frameworks? Option A. Employ a tiered risk assessment approach, starting with screening-level evaluations and progressing to more detailed quantitative analyses only if necessary, with regular opportunities for stakeholder review and input at each stage. Option B. Focus exclusively on the most technically advanced and data-intensive risk assessment methods available, prioritizing scientific precision over the ease of explanation to non-technical audiences. Option C. Conduct a simplified, qualitative risk screening based on generic exposure scenarios without extensive site-specific data collection, assuming this will be sufficient for stakeholder understanding. Option D. Utilize a highly complex, probabilistic quantitative risk assessment model from the outset, providing stakeholders with the raw model outputs and technical reports for their review. Correct answer is A. Employ a tiered risk assessment approach, starting with screening-level evaluations and progressing to more detailed quantitative analyses only if necessary, with regular opportunities for stakeholder review and input at each stage. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because environmental remediation projects often involve diverse stakeholders with varying levels of technical understanding and differing priorities. Balancing the need for scientifically sound risk assessment with the communication and acceptance of findings by non-technical stakeholders requires careful judgment. The challenge lies in selecting a risk assessment methodology that is both robust and comprehensible, ensuring that decisions are defensible and that stakeholders feel their concerns have been adequately addressed. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a transparent and iterative process that integrates stakeholder input throughout the risk assessment. This aligns with the principles of good environmental stewardship and regulatory compliance, which often mandate public participation and consideration of community concerns. By employing a tiered approach that allows for increasing levels of detail and complexity as needed, and by actively engaging stakeholders in understanding the assumptions, uncertainties, and potential outcomes, the project team builds trust and facilitates informed decision-making. This proactive engagement helps to mitigate potential conflicts and ensures that the remediation strategy is both technically sound and socially acceptable, adhering to the spirit and letter of environmental regulations that emphasize public involvement and equitable risk management. An incorrect approach that relies solely on a highly complex quantitative model without adequate explanation or stakeholder consultation fails ethically and regulatorily. Such an approach can lead to a lack of transparency, fostering distrust and suspicion among stakeholders who may feel excluded from the decision-making process. This can result in project delays, legal challenges, and ultimately, a less effective remediation outcome. Ethically, it violates the principle of informed consent and public participation. Regulatorily, it may fall short of requirements for public notification and comment periods, potentially leading to non-compliance with environmental laws that mandate clear communication of risks and remediation plans. Another incorrect approach that uses a simplified, qualitative screening without sufficient investigation into site-specific conditions or potential exposure pathways will be professionally unsound. While seemingly efficient, this can lead to an underestimation of risks, potentially resulting in inadequate remediation measures. This failure to adequately characterize risks is a direct violation of professional responsibility and regulatory requirements to protect human health and the environment. Ethically, it represents negligence and a disregard for the potential long-term consequences of insufficient action. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Identify all relevant stakeholders and their potential concerns. 2. Select a risk assessment methodology that is appropriate for the site complexity, available data, and regulatory requirements, considering the need for stakeholder comprehension. 3. Develop a clear communication plan to explain the methodology, assumptions, uncertainties, and findings to stakeholders in an accessible manner. 4. Establish mechanisms for ongoing stakeholder feedback and incorporate relevant input into the risk assessment and remediation planning process. 5. Document all decisions, justifications, and stakeholder interactions thoroughly. 6. Continuously evaluate the effectiveness of the risk assessment and communication strategies and adapt as necessary. Question 19. The efficiency study reveals that a Phase I environmental site assessment, ESSA, for a property in California is experiencing significant delays, jeopardizing the client's acquisition closing schedule. The project manager is considering several strategies to accelerate the process. Which of the following strategies best balances the need for timely completion with the regulatory and professional standards for conducting a Phase I ESA? Option A. Proceed with issuing a preliminary report based on incomplete data, with a disclaimer that further investigation may be required to meet the client's immediate deadline. Option B. Reduce the scope of the historical records review by omitting inquiries into past land use and occupancy for properties adjacent to the subject site, and shorten the interview process with current and past site managers. Option C. Immediately inform the client of the delays and propose a revised timeline based on a thorough review of the current progress, identifying specific areas where resources can be reallocated or additional support can be brought in to address bottlenecks without compromising the core investigative components of the ESA. Option D. Expedite the site reconnaissance by limiting the duration of the site walkthrough and focusing only on obviously distressed areas, while also reducing the number of historical sources reviewed to only readily accessible online databases. Correct answer is D. Expedite the site reconnaissance by limiting the duration of the site walkthrough and focusing only on obviously distressed areas, while also reducing the number of historical sources reviewed to only readily accessible online databases. Explanation. The efficiency study reveals that a Phase I environmental site assessment, ESSA, conducted for a commercial property acquisition in California is taking significantly longer than anticipated, impacting the closing timeline. The project manager is under pressure to expedite the process. This scenario is professionally challenging because it pits the need for timely transaction completion against the regulatory requirement for thoroughness and accuracy in environmental due diligence. Rushing an ESA can lead to overlooking critical environmental concerns, potentially exposing the client to significant future liabilities, and violating the standards of professional practice and regulatory expectations under the U.S. EPA framework and relevant state laws. The correct approach involves a careful review of the ESA's progress, identifying specific bottlenecks without compromising the scope of work. This might involve reallocating resources, clarifying information requests with regulatory agencies or property owners, or prioritizing the most critical data gathering activities. This represents best professional practice because it demonstrates a commitment to fulfilling contractual obligations and regulatory requirements while actively managing project timelines. It upholds the ethical duty to provide competent services and avoid misrepresentation of the environmental condition of the property. Adherence to ASTM E1527 standards, which are widely recognized and often incorporated by reference in regulatory guidance, is paramount. An incorrect approach would be to unilaterally shorten the site reconnaissance, reduce the scope of historical records review, or skip interviews with current or past occupants without a justifiable reason and client consultation. Such actions would be regulatory and ethical failures. Specifically, failing to conduct a thorough site reconnaissance violates ASTM E1527 requirements for visual inspection and can lead to missing obvious signs of environmental concern. Omitting historical research or interviews bypasses crucial steps in identifying recognized environmental conditions, REC, which is the primary objective of a Phase I ESA. This could also constitute a breach of professional duty and potentially violate state-specific environmental assessment regulations that mandate certain investigative steps. Another incorrect approach would be to rely solely on readily available online data without verifying its accuracy or completeness, or to make assumptions about the absence of RECs without adequate investigation. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to meet the standard of care expected in environmental professional practice. The professional decision-making process in such situations should involve 1. Understanding the contractual scope of work and relevant regulatory standards, e.g., ASTM E1527, EPA guidance. 2. Identifying the specific reasons for delays. 3. Evaluating the potential impact of any proposed shortcuts on the accuracy and completeness of the assessment. 4. Communicating transparently with the client about the delays and potential solutions, including any risks associated with expedited timelines. 5. Seeking client approval for any modifications to the scope of work. 6. Documenting all decisions and communications thoroughly. Question 20. Which approach would be most appropriate for a certified environmental remediation specialist to take when developing a remediation strategy for a site contaminated with both volatile organic compounds, VOC, in soil and dissolved metals in groundwater, where preliminary data suggests potential co-migration and transformation pathways? Option A. Conduct a comprehensive investigation into the potential interactions between VOCs and dissolved metals, including their influence on each other's mobility, persistence, and potential for forming new compounds, before finalizing the remediation strategy. Option B. Prioritize remediation of the VOCs in soil, assuming the dissolved metals in groundwater will be addressed independently once soil remediation is complete. Option C. Focus remediation efforts on the groundwater contamination, as dissolved metals are typically more mobile and pose a greater immediate risk than soil-bound VOCs. Option D. Implement a generic soil vapor extraction system for VOCs and a pump-and-treat system for groundwater, without further investigation into contaminant interactions. The correct answer is B. Prioritize remediation of the VOCs in soil, assuming the dissolved metals in groundwater will be addressed independently once soil remediation is complete. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging due to the complex interplay of contaminants across different environmental media, soil, water, air, and the potential for synergistic or antagonistic interactions that can alter their behavior, fate, and transport. A thorough understanding of these interactions is critical for effective risk assessment and the selection of appropriate remediation strategies, ensuring compliance with environmental regulations and protecting human health and the environment. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a comprehensive, science-based investigation that directly addresses the potential for contaminant interactions. This aligns with the principles of due diligence and the regulatory requirement to thoroughly characterize a contaminated site before implementing remediation. By considering how contaminants might influence each other's mobility, persistence, and toxicity, professionals can develop more accurate conceptual site models and select remediation technologies that are effective under site-specific conditions, thereby fulfilling their ethical and regulatory obligations to achieve site closure in a safe and compliant manner. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on individual contaminants without considering their interactions would be professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a lack of due diligence and an incomplete site characterization, which could lead to the selection of ineffective remediation technologies. This would result in regulatory noncompliance, as remediation goals might not be met, and could also pose ongoing environmental and health risks, violating ethical obligations to protect public welfare. Another incorrect approach that prematurely selects a remediation technology based on limited data, without a thorough understanding of contaminant interactions, demonstrates a failure to apply sound scientific principles and a disregard for the complexity of the site. This can lead to wasted resources, prolonged remediation efforts, and potential regulatory enforcement actions. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough site investigation, including the collection of data that can inform potential contaminant interactions. This involves reviewing historical data, conducting targeted sampling and analysis, and utilizing fate and transport modeling that accounts for these interactions. The framework should then involve a risk assessment that considers the combined effects of contaminants and the development of remediation alternatives that are specifically designed to address these complex interactions. Finally, ongoing monitoring and adaptive management are crucial to ensure the chosen remediation strategy remains effective as contaminant behaviors evolve.